Um, Welcome back, everybody. Matt Leck and David here, and we are joined by our good friend and comrade, Lillian Cicerchia, who is a professor of philosophy and one of the co-hosts of the absolutely excellent podcast, What's Left of Philosophy. Thanks so much for joining us, Lillian.
Thanks for having me, guys. Happy to be back.
Well, I wish we had some, more upbeat subject matter to talk to, but we will be having you stick around a little bit for the post game with us today. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about abortion, socialist feminism, etc. But before we really get into the nitty gritty of all this kind of stuff, I know you're abroad right now, but when you saw this decision from the Supreme Court, I was just sort of curious what your initial reaction was to it.
I think my heart, sank a little, but not that much because I was expecting it and have been for a long time. And I think if, people who are involved in reproductive rights organizations and in whatever capacity, this is the kind of thing that before it, things get to stay very much the same because this is a fight over 45 years that we've been losing, and when you're losing, you're losing. My second reaction was just anger, and not really even at the right in a certain way, because I've spent my whole life being angry at the right. I also felt anger at the left. I think that there's both liberals and I think the far left, an inability to reckon with one's failures when you've been losing for that long, and the inability of the left, not for reasons that are always under our control or even under left liberals' control, but just the lack of political cohesion and wherewithal and strategy to shift this debate or the strategy at all. I think some accounting needs to go on about that. And I'm not sure it is, and I hope it is,
Well, I mean, I want to get into some of the larger stuff, but one of the reasons I thought about bringing you on to have this conversation is you made a really interesting structural point about the U.S. initially after it happened, where you basically were making the argument about the difference in the American system versus a parliamentary system in Europe, where in America you can shift dramatically in just a matter of a couple of days on the status of abortion versus in Europe, where that system sort of encourages people to to compromise a little bit more. I mean, one point that I was always trying to remind folks of is that when they were pushing this horrible law in Texas, the first big restriction, which was worth opposing for a myriad of different reasons, it actually was very similar to what the status of abortion access is in countries like Spain and Italy. I mean, I'd just be curious if you had anything else to add to that, because I thought that was a really astute point that I think a lot of times there's a little bit, there's not enough political analysis into how things actually come into being in this country, especially when you're trying to build a strategy that protects this right indefinitely.
Yeah, so I think what you're pointing out is that like with a lot of things, and sometimes with good reason and sometimes not, the American left and liberals, I'm just kind of grouping them all together, this particular issue, there's not a huge difference in strategy and what organizations are doing and so on, even though I think people are ideologically across a wider spectrum. I just don't think that politically the spectrum is that wide. So if you're on the left and you're that's the Democrats and the liberals, not us, ask yourself which organizations you are a part of. Is it Planned Parenthood? Well, even if you're more radical than Planned Parenthood, you're a part of the NGO strategy. You know what I mean? So it's just the clinics and in that world, it's not a wide spectrum of strategy and debate. And that's why I just to clarify why I'm kind of grouping people together. So I think that in this world, like with many other issues, the American left is very myopic about its own conditions. And the conditions are very distinct. So in some sense, this is justified. In another sense, it shuts the political imagination prematurely off to counterfactuals, like what would have happened if we did this, and why did another country develop differently? Like they also have a crazy conservative religious right,
Mhm.
or at least they did in the past. Why did it change? Why did this go down differently over there than it did over here? Why are we regressing when other countries in South America or in Ireland are, or in Europe or South America are making social progress? Like, why is this happening? And the only thing people seem to be able to come up with is just like the unique facts about American culture. Like they're especially religious, and so on and so forth. And I just think like we're at a stage socially where this like can't be the only answer that you're giving, where it's like the idiosyncrasies of the culture are the reason this is happening. There have to be there that exists, but we've really dissected that as much as like humanly possible. So at some point other things have to like be also analyzed, like actual political strategies of the past, present, and future. What institutions facilitated, like cementing reproductive rights, to what extent, in what places. And we just don't do that. And like in the US, I think Alex Gurovich made a really good point on the Afibunga Bunga podcast recently. He did an episode on abortion and freedom. And he made the great point that the strategy that won abortion rights in the US was very anti democratic in a sense, relying on the Supreme Court. There was no, even though there was a democratic mandate in a sense for
Mhm.
abortion rights and for women's rights, that path was not pursued. This is what I mean. Like, we should be asking why. And in other countries, like other compromises were made, like in Germany, it's not legal, but it's not illegal either. And it's illegal for someone to prevent you from getting an abortion, but you can, but, and the reason all of this happened is a compromise with the Christian Democrats, the Conservative Party in the 70s. And you can argue against the limitations of that compromise, but you need to ask yourself why that was possible and why there's no insane right wing challenging like the status
Mm.
quo in Germany, because it's embedded within a healthcare system that works for everybody for the most part. So like this is like a winding way to say that like we can't just constantly talk about religion and culture. We have got to talk about institutions, policies, what compromises, what is it that we can do to secure people's rights. And I just don't think that the conversation is like almost ever about that.
Yeah, I mean, like, one of the big criticisms I think you can outline in the US is that, like, if you remember, I mean, none of us were around during this time, but like, if you look at the history of like the women's movement in this country, particularly around the right to an abortion, I mean, it was extremely ascendant at the time that like Roe v. Wade, came into being. And it seemed like that was probably, something that was going to come legislatively in the near future. But once it went through the court system, it sort of got suspended permanently. And also, like an entire generation, I think, of like American feminists um, were sort of taught to think about this issue from one, a legal framework, and two, like a very
Yeah.
conservative one, where it's like, it's not about just like, a conversation about personal, like, or just general autonomy. It was like the much more conservative of right to privacy. Um, and I do think that like this is a moment where like there's a lot of space for there to be a reckoning. I mean, I don't know if you followed or saw what happened in Kansas recently.
Mm.
Um, but like I always remind folks, sorry if I'm rambling on, but like I always remind folks that like even here in Texas, which is like one of those places where everyone's like the religious right is so powerful, the culture is this or that or this or that. Abortion rights are like, significant, like are significantly popular. Now, the question is like at what stage people think they should happen. But like the actual amount of Texans who think there should be absolutely no abortion under any circumstances is like an extreme minority. In the society, which is like, obviously we can get mad at the right wing, but like, that means that there's like a public mandate or at least a desire, and we have to build a vehicle for them to be able to, build power and demand the things that they want.
Yeah, I mean, my thing is this, which if something is that popular, which abortion rights are, like 70% of the American population supports abortion rights. This isn't like just a tiny majority. This isn't half the country that's for and half the country that's against, which is how it's posed in the media, this is just like most people support women's rights and
Mm,
reproductive rights. Okay, so given that, what is it that has not been done to leverage the social power and conviction of that majority to secure these rights? And at some point, the answer has to come back to the Democratic Party is a problem. And the way the left relates to the Democratic Party is a problem. The NGOs are a problem. And these aren't things that you can just like dance around and be like, no, 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 we're going to do our own thing. But your relationship on the left to these institutions on this issue is a problem at some point. And you have to start asking, how do we make arguments and work with the for and against these people to do something differently?
mm,
And like, because clearly there is a majority that is just going on, like it's going unorganized, it's not being voiced, and the strategy has been primarily legal, and just this like battle in the courts for decades. And the popular opinion has basically only become more progressive on issues like this over time, and nonetheless we are losing. So this is what I'm talking about, where it's like the that things are that like things are that backwards means that like self-criticism is warranted.
mhm,
And the feminist left does deserve criticism, and liberals, because the basis on which this was won was narrow. Then the kind of solidification of a certain kind of legal strategy that certain institutions like NGOs that provide all of these services start to depend on, which reinforces their relationship to the Democratic Party, that is becoming more and more recent over time to defend these rights. This is a very vicious cycle, and it's a cycle. And it really prevents people from, in order to stay open, maintain your funding, be able to provide the services. And when people get, you have to do certain things. And when people get funneled into this work, they get funneled into that world, which is structurally designed to like shut down other possibilities because it is primarily defensive in nature. So attempts to ideologically broad spectrum, like Black feminists in the 90s, start about reproductive justice in this context, to talk about human rights as broader than abortion rights, including the right to have a family if one wants one, a kind of
mhm,
anti-poverty program. I think this is basically really positive. I also think that there are some problems because it is basically still couched in the same NGO institutional context that has all these other problems. So there's like
mm.
a strategic issue that needs to be untangled um, out of this mess. And I'm not sure how much more clearly to say it. And I really like the articles I've written about this are really like, I'd really like people to see that, basically,
Mhm.
because I don't think anybody has like the answer. I just want, I think there's a problem that needs to be like unfolded.
Well, I want to in a second expand this a little bit to like socialist feminism in general, but before we get, I mean,
Mhm.
like there's a lot of different avenues we could go down, but I think like most people who like listen to left wing podcasts know, like we can talk about how like cowardly Joe Biden's been. Can talk about how miserable the Democratic Party has been for decades, right? But I think what might be interesting since we have you here is maybe to take it a little bit closer to home, because I've also seen people on like the socialist left sort of struggle to really articulate um, abortion rights and trying to fit it in with our larger program. Like I totally agree in the sense of like placing it in like a broader context of you know care and healthcare, etc. But like one thing that I think was sort of myopic maybe was this really early days thing where when people were talking about abortion rights, and I think it's just because the muscles on the left are so predisposition to doing this, that the only way they could talk about it was in like the case of like the most marginalized in society. And there's always these lines, it's like, well, rich people will still be able to get abortion, so it's not as much of a problem to them. And like I'd be curious to hear your response to that tactic, because I totally agree, one, that this is like a class issue, but I also think that that sometimes misdirects the kind of popular nature of this. And like, yeah, okay, you're a rich person in Houston, and you need to like flee the state to do that, that's a huge pain in the ass. It's like, obviously you're better off than somebody who's stuck here and can't get out. But it's still something that affects, wealthy folks too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the class angle really matters. It matters for actual left-wing response to the institutional problems I was just discussing, because you're not going to get a solution to that institutional riddle of like NGOs,
Mm-hmm.
Democratic Party, and lack of like, other social services for women and their dependents if you're like relying on like rich women as a part of your strategy. There's like limitations to the, cross-class alliance, as it were. However, I really do think that shifting of the moral territory, like this is bad because it affects the most marginalized people and not other people, is my intuition is also that that's extremely, it's the wrong thing to say. Like, it's ridiculous that any person who is pregnant, whether they are rich or not, has to fly across the country or to some other place across a desert or whatever because they need to go to a clinic. Like, this is insane, and it doesn't have anything like yes, this will obviously, but I have you ever read Willie Parker's book? He's a Christian doctor, abortion doctor, who wrote an interesting book about the moral case for abortion from a Christian perspective. And he's very well known in the reproductive rights movement for this argument and for his role. And, he just said some of the anecdotes that he shared in that book where was that, like, in the abortion clinic, if there's only one in your state, there's a great big equalizing that's happening there, that people from all walks of life come to his office, and he deals with patients from everywhere of all types. You have, it's hard to even describe, but like the idea that this is something that isn't affecting all women, and like, it's just absurd, and it just, like, defending someone's freedom, she that hard, it means high ground, which is what happened over the past years. The right has the moral high ground, and like, I don't think we're particularly confident about this issue. I think people are tired of it. Like, it's not that always that fun to like be the abortion lady. People think of it as kind of like it's a niche, and people think of it as a culture war issue, but it's a lot more than that. It's about the freedom to live your life and the way that you want to, the right to have families, the right to not have families. What the state is and isn't responsible for, like, is it responsible for like making sure you reproduce in the right way and with who, or is it responsible for making sure that you are able to like raise a healthy family if you want it, and that you're not coerced to have an abortion if you don't, if you do want that. So like, we have this way of talking about it that is extremely narrow, and it's and it becomes kind of an embarrassing, and then it's like very moralistic, like only the poor are going to suffer, and they will. But this is this is really broader than that, and it shouldn't be that hard to try to sell a wider vision of what it means for women to live decent lives. That should be compelling to a large section of the population. But instead, we just say those women are fine, and everybody else is, we're going to like means test our freedom, our complaints about freedom, basically.
Lillian, can you just go into, you mentioned earlier the sort of deal in Germany, but with the social Christian Democrats. Can you just talk a little bit more about like the practicality of abortion in Germany, just to, so we can contrast it with America here, and what is like the fight where, as far as like the reproductive justice fight in Germany, like what is being fought for there?
Well, okay, so the situation with abortion is that it was technically like decriminalized, although I don't love that like language. I think it makes it seem like you're talking about marijuana, like we're just not going to throw you in jail. But it's not legal in a positive sense, but it's also not illegal. And there are women who seek abortions are protected from like coercive measures to get involved. So like the state or counselors or doctors are not allowed to prevent you from deciding to have an abortion. But the compromise is that you have to go through is that kind of ambiguous legal status, and you have to go through a kind of intermediate counselor type of person who refers you to an abortion. But this is very different than what people are worried about in the US, which are people who try to convince you to not have an abortion. It's much less invasive than that, and they are obligated to get you care. Abortion is only legal up to 12 weeks, which is actually a shorter term than in many blue states in the US. And so this is like not a paradise. I think the contrast is that there, as far as I'm aware, there is no like challenge to the status quo coming from the right. And I'm not really sure how much organizing around this issue among feminists are going on. And in fact, I've talked to a few people who used to be really opposed to the counsel part of it, but then later kind of softened on that for various reasons, because it didn't turn, people just have different opinions about how patronizing that is, how to what extent it can be positive, not. But it's not the same thing as going to like some fake crisis pregnancy center or whatever. So I think that's why they're less hard on it, or some people are. So yeah, I don't know how much like fight there is on this issue at this time. There is a lot of fight currently in Spain. I just read in Le Monde this morning that the Spanish right is demonstrating against abortion. There's a lot of battle going on in Poland. But there are some places in which there is kind of like a compromise status quo. France, Germany. The Netherlands is the most progressive place in Europe on this issue. So you can have an abortion up, I think, until like 24 weeks or something, like a late-term abortion. It has the most lenient regulations in Europe, but interestingly, only has an 8% abortion rate out of for women. And in the U.S., it's much higher, like 1 out of 3 women. So the difference is really like that it's accessible, and there's really comprehensive sexual education, and there is actually like a welfare state. So the interesting thing about it is that when you make the laws more lenient and then you actually provide social support, there is no trade-off. I mean, this is this particular country's example. In the Netherlands, there is no trade-off between your freedom and like supporting families and children and dependents and so on. And I think sometimes on the left, like there's this idea, I think there's kind of this interest in like pro-life feminism where like instead of abortion rights, we could like have social welfare. I think this is a really wild trade-off to propose to people, like this, because it's not necessary. As like, I don't know, like no one's forcing you to make this trade-off. So and actually doing the opposite has more desired results for everybody, because what it means is that actually people are just making less coerced choices. So women are not going to have abortions if they don't want them, because they've either had good sexual education or they like just aren't making poor choices coerced by poverty or something. So if we give people all of the social rights that they need, then actually we all win. And so I don't quite get that way of thinking about things.
So I know this is a big topic to tackle, so we can do it incrementally. But I was hoping, like, a lot of people who are on the U.S. left right now, and this is a good thing because we have more people on the U.S. left, but they came in sort of like a patchwork way, because, you get interested in Bernie Sanders, you learned a lot about politics through that, then you may start reading Jacobin or whatever. So a lot of people have sort of been building up their own kind of understanding of like social thought and history here. And I was wondering, and because like the specific context of like the Bernie run, was like there was like a culture clash that was going on where like there was a criticism of this kind of dominant form of feminism in the United States. Um, and but I think that people rightfully saw how like paper thin that kind of ideology was, but I also think it's sort of left us with bad habits too, because I think a lot of people haven't really spent time sort of like reworking their worldview, particularly around like the intersection of like class and gender. And I was wondering, maybe to start, and then we can get a little bit into like socialist feminism and like social reproduction theory, just a little bit. I know we don't have a lot of time, but like, could you maybe frame for people who consider themselves to be socialists, why like, abortion rights in particular are like, key socialist values. And then we can maybe talk a little bit more broadly.
Okay, why are they socialist values? Well, I don't know if I really thought of it quite like that.
Mhm.
So I think that one of the reason, okay, so there's a couple different levels. There's moral arguments, there's political arguments, and there's abortion is a messy layer in between. So my own moral view, okay, like this is just how I think about things. I think there should be as many abortions as women who want them. Like I don't think that there is a problem with women having abortions, and I reject the idea that there's something to apologize for. Like the safe, legal, and rare liberal discourse is not my thing. However, I think that it is normal to have many different views about the question, and I don't think you need me entirely on that point to see it as a political right worth defending. I think that this is a debate in which people's moral opinions become a matter of political principle in a way that is not always like transparent. So it's quite possible to think people do things in a liberal society where people have liberal rights, freedom of expression, and all these things that we say we like. People do things that I don't agree with all the time, and that they are able to. I think abortion is not that different than that. And as a political point, I think defending these rights is important so that women have agency over their futures. The cost of making abortion illegal is both risk of health and safety, but also that women are not actually able to look at their futures and think of themselves as being able to act in the world in a way that is as a peer or as an equal with their male counterparts. It means that women look at the world and they see all of these risks that they are responsible for that are not shared by their peers, and these risks are taken, and sometimes people make decisions, and then the downsides to them are reinforced by institutions that are punishing and unforgiving about any choices or risks that have taken in their lives. So even if they don't think that getting an abortion or they don't want to and they want to have a family and there's no problem there, doing so at a young age or at the wrong place in time or at the wrong part of your life, or before you get a promotion, or before you're able to do some extensive job training or whatever, all of this, these are things that interrupt women's ability to participate in society, in the labor market, and therefore they affect ability to be equals within their families and among and with their partners in whatever form that takes. And so if you want to support women's equality, you have to deter their reproductive lives, because a lot follows from that. The kind of dependencies will find themselves suffering under, whether it be from kind of being closed off into certain labor markets, dependent on partners, even though right now that's not really going well because people are employed and marriage lapsed. Nonetheless, the point is that this particular right is not just a personal right. It's a social right that connects to every other kind of right that we think women should be equal in having. And so that's what I mean by it's connected to a bigger picture. And I see how you can support things like other kinds of social rights and think, well, this one I have moral prowess with. Well, I think it's a part of the package for the left.
Mhm. Well, I think it'd actually be a little unfair to open up the entirety of socialist feminism right now as a topic. So we might just have to get you on to do another bit on that in the near future. I know you're going to join us for a little bit in the post game. We really appreciate that. If you wanted to, just for the public audience, maybe as a teaser, if there are any thinkers or writers that people who might be looking to learn a little bit more about these, about like socialist, socialist feminism in general, that you might want to direct people to?
Yeah. Okay. So I think Loretta Ross and Ricky Solinger wrote a book called Introduction to Reproductive Justice. I think that's a good one. That's like a good starter book to understand the debates like about the liberal strategy. And then Rosalind Paczewski in 1990 wrote a great book called Abortion and Women's Choice. It's called The State, Sexuality, and Reproductive Freedom. And I think it's the best socialist book on the issue that I know about. There isn't much in that world. But,
Well, Lillian, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much.
yeah, thanks, guys.